everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 6th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And it has been a whirlwind since I finally defended my dissertation, completed my internship, and was officially granted my PhD. I've got the diploma in the mail to prove it. Now I just got to get a frame. It's been a while, so I'm going to catch you up on my life before we dive into the episode, in case you're curious. Maybe you're not, but I'll keep it brief. So I finished my PhD officially on August 31st, and for a little over a month, I was traveling in Europe and the UK. I also was doing this long road trip from Florida back to Los Angeles, but I stopped to visit my folks in Texas along the way. And so I've been a little bit rudderless. There are tenants living in my house in LA. So I haven't been home, actually home, in well over a year. I'm actually staying with friends currently. My road trip has been really fun. I got a new Maverick and I've been kitting it out. I got a Go Fast camper added to the top, so it includes a roof tent. And I've been traveling and camping and just generally being outdoors, which I absolutely love, and I think I really need it after so much work. Anyway, a bit frazzled, a bit, like I said, lacking an anchor right now, but I'm keeping the show going as best as I can. You may have noticed that I recorded a bunch of episodes prior to leaving, and those are the episodes that I've been airing for the past month or so. This next episode, the one I'm presenting to you today, I actually recorded while I was away. So as I mentioned, I was in Europe last month, and specifically I was in the UK. I was in Manchester, London, then I left for Sweden for a little bit, and then I came back and spent some time in Scotland. But when I was in Manchester, so that would be September 23rd and 24th, I was there to speak at QED, which is, I've got to say, hands down, my favorite conference to go to. So much fun. Highly recommend it if you are into science and skepticism and social justice and all those good things. And while I was there, I got to record a live episode of my podcast. And so that is what I'm going to be presenting to you now. I had the opportunity to sit down with Anita Powell. She is a community engagement advocate and a menopause activist. She also works in diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially for women of color, and she hosts the podcast Black Menopause and Beyond. So without any further ado, here she is, Anita Powell. Welcome, everyone, to this live recording of Talk Nerdy with Cara Santa Maria. So we are recording this on Sunday, September 24th, and we're live from the QED conference in Manchester. I'm actually really curious, before we dive into the show, what percentage of the kind of in-house audience hails from the UK, the US, or outside of those two countries. So raise your hand. The podcast listeners can't see any of this, but whatever, I don't care. Raise your hands if you are here in town from the US. If you're, okay, that's great. Because I've noticed that this weekend we've had a really large US contingent. When I'm sort of at the bar chatting with people, getting to, it's there's so many American accents. And how many people here are from within the UK? Most everyone. And then what about not those two? Okay, yeah, great, amazing. Okay, great. So this is a good mix. So today we're going to be chatting with Anita Powell. She's a community engagement advocate and activist covering social inequality, heritage, and menopause. And before we get into some of those before we get into the content, I want to know a little bit more about the person. So welcome, first of all, welcome. And I know that your work where you spend the majority of your time now is both personal and professional. And so I'm really curious, first and foremost, sort of how you got into this world.
Well, previously my background was just doing administration type thing. But I've always had a feeling that injustice was wrong. It's just naturally ingrained into my personality and character. So in my first job when I was 19, I was the union rep, and I was trained up on how to go into meetings with HR when someone who was complaining about being disciplined, and I'm like 19 and they're like 40, and I'm like, yes, you're wrong and stuff like that. So I've always naturally felt that injustice was wrong, and I've felt a natural duty to call it out and address it.
Yeah. And so tell me a little bit about sort of your journey to this place. This is your mentality of where you came from, but what kind of work did you previously do and how did you get here?
Well, it was just around different types of administration jobs. I was a local government worker for over 10 years. So I've done loads of stuff. I've worked in planning department. I've worked in land charges, and I've just done loads of stuff around general local government work. It's predominantly administration. For me, I suppose the change happened when I had children. And there's my coffee being delivered. I'm going to leave this in the podcast, I think. Thank you, sir. The jet lag is now being treated. Okay, so you were mentioning when you first started, when you first had children. How many children do you have? I've got 2 children. Okay. 2 children. So I became a mum, and my now ex-husband spent a lot of time, not in England, actually spent a lot of time in Africa with his mum and his dad, because his dad was dying and they had a business. But I was raising like a newborn and a 2-year-old and working part-time by myself. And also looking after a father who's passed away now, but he was just extremely stubborn, my father. So I spent a lot of time looking after him as well, which was an ongoing. And the reason why I say stubborn, my father was diagnosed with he was told he had suspected prostate cancer, but my dad refused to believe it. So he refused treatment. So I helped him for years as he declined, and throughout the whole, because it took him years to die of the cancer. Yeah. And throughout the whole time, he refused to accept that he had prostate cancer, which eventually it spread, and it did kill him.
Yeah, and sadly, like the work that I do as a psychologist, I've been working in an oncology center for many years, and I'm going back there now for my postdoc. And I don't see it as often in the oncology center because, of course, by definition, there's a sampling bias there. People are there to get treatment. But the denial around how ill one is becoming and the progression of the disease is such a common factor. And then you add to that if there's any fear of the healthcare system. I'm just curious, do you know where some of that kind of denial and resistance comes from or came from for your father?
I think there was a denial. There was a fear of the healthcare system. I feel at the beginning, he entertained my concern. So I don't quite know exactly what happened, but back then there was a test where a finger and his private parts were involved. And even though my dad, he was prepared for that, and I'm going to be honest, I bullied him into going. I had to put everything out the hat and say that, I want you to go. You don't want to go, but go for me, go for your grandchildren. And so he went, and I think the whole experience of that test was so daunting for him, he refused to go back into hospital.
Right.
Yeah, and it was traumatic for him. I know one incident afterwards, I did take him in to hospital, and then he had a bad leg, so I sat him down, whatever, and then parked the car. When I came back, he disappeared. He was apparently seen running over the bridge back home. And at that point, he just refused.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to
book appointments, and he said, okay, I'll turn up. Because I really had to go at him. And then I used to turn up an hour before the appointment, and he used to disappear 2 hours before the appointment. That's how intense his fear was of accepting the fact that he had a cancer, and also going into a space where he did not want to be in.
And I can imagine, I mean, obviously I'm jumping ahead a bit, but how much this personal experience and the empathy sort of gathered from this personal experience must translate into some of the community activism that you do, and working with individuals, working with marginalized communities, working with interfacing within the healthcare system, that there's so many reasons that as healthcare consumers, as women, as individuals of color, as individuals with varied backgrounds, as immigrants, folks struggle, right? And we know that it comes from, it's intersectional. It's just across the board, it's intersectional. But having this very personal, historical experience of working with your father and sort of seeing or trying to see this through his eyes, I can imagine that has been affecting for you as you work with individuals within the community as well.
I mean, I'm going to be very honest with you. My whole childhood was challenging because I'm neurodiverse. I have 2 neurodiverse children, and I suspect that both my parents were neurodiverse. So I grew up, I would consider myself to be kind of high functioning, even though I'm dyslexic, I have neurodiverse characteristics. And I, as a child, I now realise I was a carer for 2 adults who struggled socially, and struggled with loads of things. So, and also I know with regards to my mum's childhood, her childhood was quite traumatic because my mum grew up as one of 7 children.
Wow.
In the Caribbean, and they were poor.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't quite understand the dynamics of my grandparents. I never met my grandparents, but my grandfather never lived with his 6 or 7 kids, I've forgotten how many, and his wife. He lived like a few bits of land up the road.
Huh. Yeah. What country in the Caribbean? It's
a little island called Carriacou, which belongs to one of the Grenadine Islands, which belong to Grenada. So I think the population is less than 3,000. Everyone knows each other. And some.
Can you imagine? Yeah, wow.
So I think I don't quite know the full details, but my mum apparently was quite troublesome. So my grandma couldn't handle my mother, so my grandma gave my mother to an auntie who couldn't have children. So just that alone is quite complex, because as a child, my mum grew up rejected and never grew up with her siblings because she was considered to be troubled.
Right. And did she at least attribute that to being different? I mean, like you said, your assumption is that they were neurodiverse, but that was never sort of overt. That was never diagnosed. There was no sort of, And did she see that in herself? Do you think, did she have that kind of insight?
No, and culturally as well, it's not something that, I mean, even within the UK, going back 80 odd years, neurodiverseness was like non-existent.
I mean, even today we're still struggling to, yeah.
So you go back to the Caribbean, that's just non-existent.
And so, so much, I think it's always so interesting on Talk Nerdy. Each week I interview a different scientist or science writer or activist or just like interesting person about their work. But I love this component of knowing how you got to your work and what frame you do your work through. Because I think sometimes, especially in the sciences, I think we might even see this. I'm going to try and kind of bridge the gap because I'm at a skeptic conference right now, but we see this sometimes in skeptic conventions or atheist conventions or these different kind of worlds that collide. There's this emphasis on like pure science. There's this emphasis on sort of like, what is the evidence? And that's the only thing I'm concerned about. And the humanism is sometimes a bit decoupled. But the truth of the matter is, we do this work as people, with people, for people. And so I'm super curious about the people that you interface with in your work. Where is the advocacy? Where is the activism? Where do you end up putting most of your energy?
But over the past, it's been over 10 years, and I've done different types of community projects. I'm quite unique in a way because I cover all different areas. If somebody offers me a job and they feel I can do it, I participate and I bring to the table what I've learned from my own lived experience as well as learned from other projects and whatever. So I've worked with all kinds of people, and some of the places I've worked have been really challenging for me. And I think I'm going to mention this is the most challenging project I ever had to work with, this particular one, where I had to work with a group of ex-offenders, and half the group, all of them were men, and half the group were ex-sex offenders. So as an advocate for women and children, and someone who's a mother, that the complexity of having to show compassion, understanding, helping and signposting men who traditionally I would see as the enemy was challenging. And I feel I did a good job at what I did, and I understood my mission. My mission was to help influence them not be triggered into their own behaviour.
Yeah.
So I took a different approach to working with them, because some of the people I'd worked with, their behaviour was influenced by their background. And one particular person, he was actually, I don't know his crime, but I know that he had been in prison for over 10 years and he related to children. And that's all I know. I didn't want to know, to be honest with you. But I actually really liked him. And that alone was quite a challenge for me to really like him. And I could see with him that he probably suffered in prison. He had serious mental health issues. He was very lonely, and I think his loneliness started from a child.
And he may have been a victim himself. Yeah, it's very common. Yeah.
So my approach in dealing with him was totally different than how I'd normally treat people. So I no longer met him in the office. And what I did was I worked out with him socially what he liked to do. Because when he came out in prison, he was not allowed to go back to where he grew up. So that's why I don't know what he did, but he wasn't allowed. And he hadn't seen his mother, who he used to be really close with, since he was in prison. And they weren't allowed to see each other. Yeah. So I really don't know what he did. So loneliness was a major issue. And he was not allowed to use digital material. So what I had to do with him is work out what he enjoyed doing. And I no longer met him in an office environment. I went looking for social activities that he might want to do. And that's what we did. We socialised together. And my aim for him was to formulate new connections which were healthy.
Yeah.
And to develop his self-worth so he was less likely to rely on his previous behaviour to give him worth and enjoyment. So we used to, once a week, meet up at different hobbies. He liked making stuff, and he liked painting and drawing. And so he was with me for about 4 or 5 months. And that's all we did. I didn't fill in one CV with him. He was highly intelligent. I didn't need to do that with him. What I needed to do was help improve his self-esteem and his mental health, and help him form healthy relationships with adults.
There's so much crossover, right, between the work that you did, especially in this specific situation, and the clinical work, the world that I come from, or at least more recently. And it brings up, for me, a really interesting ethical sort of conundrum, which is that most psychologists are trained, regardless of your orientation or how you conceptualize cases, most psychologists are trained with the sort of core ethic of Carl Rogers, which is sort of unconditional positive regard and empathy for your client and just this ethic of like, I'm here for you regardless of who you are, regardless of where you come from, regardless of what you might have done. I am fully validating your existence as a human being. And so individuals who do work with offenders, especially with offenders who have committed crimes against children, sex crimes against children, things of that nature, a lot of trainees struggle in this area, but it's like an important experience, training experience, to learn how to set those biases aside, or at least grapple with them. But there's also an ethic in psychology very often where if you're actively working with, let's say, sex offenders, you wouldn't also actively be working with the victims in parallel, because it can be so trying and traumatic, and it can kind of pull you in different directions as a practitioner. One of the growing edges that I've had a lot, and I'm super curious about your experience in this world, when you're doing advocacy, when you're working for the individuals who are struggling, who need additional support, who have sort of been given not a fair shake. Have you come across, because I've come across working with clients who are overtly racist or sexist, and really struggling as their clinician with the question of, how do I meet them where they are? How do I make a decision to support them in their journey and not moralize or say, well, it's bad for your mental health to be this way. And so part of my role is to sort of change this out of you. And I'm curious, when you're working with, let's say, victims or vulnerable populations, if you see that complicated social justice component that the victims themselves are sometimes perpetrating, and you're trying to navigate that.
I think because I work in the third sector and it's not to your degree, even though I do experience that and I do see that, they choose to be with me.
Right.
Yeah. So if they really have an issue with me as a person, they don't have to be in that room, and I don't have to be in that room either. So it's not, that challenge isn't there, because if I just don't feel it and they don't feel it, we just part our ways. But sometimes you meet someone and you just don't agree on certain things. I very often have to, my core aim, my passion is very strong when it comes to working around women and also ethnic minorities, because it's so close to who I am. So when I have to work with men, I don't hate you men, by the way. I really don't. So when I work with men, or I work with people who have racist tendencies, they are a challenge. And the complexity of racism, I mean, racism is complex. I don't view it as literally just black and white.
Right.
It has shades. So there are some people who are happy to work with me. There's some people who enjoy working with me. There are people in my life who love me as a friend, but they don't value fully who I am as a black person.
Yeah.
And because of that greyness in the third sector, it can be challenging. And sometimes you have to park that discussion, because I'm being paid not to aggravate their mental health. I'm being paid to help them progress. So if I really can't address their demon, their greyness around culture, but actually I can help them get a job, then I have to somehow find a way to park it. It doesn't necessarily mean that I never address it.
Right.
Because sometimes people's experience, that greyness appears because they've had bad lived experience, and they sometimes focus that lived experience on the colour of the person who has created that negative experience. And sometimes there are bad people who are white, black and brown. That's just the reality of who we are. And so sometimes I do try and educate them. I try and make them understand that, all kinds of bad people. Some are black, some are brown, and some are white.
Yeah.
And so I do try, but at the same time, I know I'm paid to produce outcomes which are normally about getting them into work, or kind of getting them to signpost them into education, or just basically getting them out of bed every day. Because some people literally stay in bed every single day, and they just don't want to be the best that they can be.
And I can imagine that there is sort of an ethic behind that kind of work that reinforces to you that the more sort of socially engaged, like you mentioned loneliness before, the more socially engaged we are and the more that we start to have experiences in life that give us self-efficacy or that contribute to our self-efficacy, the more likely we are to learn from other people, to see people that are different from us. So we have to be in the world to fight against some of those forces that codify and reinforce racism and sexism. And so all of that is sort of grist for getting to that better place. It's curious to me as somebody who sort of splits my time between doing this clinical work and then doing podcasting and activism in that area. And I think to one of the shows that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and how often, so the ethic on that show, or I should say the editorial sort of discretion on that show that's set by the host, is that we don't get into politics. It's a science show, it's a skepticism, we don't get in it. But of course, there are things that are inherently political that have to come up. And the place where I struggle the most is that in not going there, sometimes I feel like I am doing a disservice, like in keeping something quiet or just simply saying, I'm going to talk about this aspect, but I'm not going to contextualize it within an intersectional frame. I think I'm doing the opposite. It's like the moderates, it's kind of like the Martin Luther King quote. I butcher it, but I cite it all the time. The letter from a Birmingham jail where he talks about how he's increasingly becoming aware that it's not the Ku Klux Klaner. It's not the white citizens counselor. It's the white moderate who is just, more interested in this passive approach to justice that is causing a lot of the deep issues in our society, because we can see sort of the boogeyman and we know what the rhetoric is. But when people are like, I don't want to go there, I don't want to have that conversation, it can become quite difficult. So I'm curious, because a lot of your work is in service to the individuals who need help, but you're also working within organizational structures, right? And so how is it for you personally to navigate those organizations? Do you feel like most of the people you work with are on the same page or on the same team, or is there a lot of politics there?
I was really trying to not laugh, because inside there's stories. So when I work with an individual, I'm normally in a paid position and I understand the remit of my job.
Right.
But as an individual, I am an activist, and I used to be a co-owner of a community radio station in my town. I've done a community radio show, and I've been a speaker in my local town. So I'm known for talking.
And you have a podcast.
I've got a podcast as well about menopause and black menopause experience of black women. So and this is my unpaid work, so I don't have a boss to tell me to shut up.
Right.
And I have a certain degree of standing with my town. So I went from being really loved as being someone who's open and expressive and you can talk about those local issues. But when I question people, and I have questioned my mayor, and we fell out. Myself and my mayor. And I'm going to be honest with you, I had a really hormonal day one day, and it was the day when he lost his mayoral election. Oh. And we'd had an argument the week before because I felt that he was allowing fraud to be committed in my town, and we had this discussion, and he decided that he was going to not address the issue of fraud, and I didn't think that was fair. And the day he lost his election, I went on social media and said, Karma is a bitch, and tagged him in. Yeah. So apparently he wasn't happy, I hear. Yeah. So, but at the same time, I felt that he didn't address an issue of fraud which had an impact on the community of the town that he served. And he didn't address that issue because he liked the person who committed the fraud.
Right.
And I felt that that's unacceptable. And the thing was that not only did he do that, he then tried to get me sacked.
Oh, and you as an actor, you as an individual with a voice, you find yourself in this really complex position, because it is not incumbent on you to be the voice of, right? It's not your obligation to bring all injustice to light and to carry all of that on your shoulders. But at the same time, isn't there that internal struggle sometimes of silence is violence? I can't not say something right now.
I think yes, and also I think that one of my empowerment about being menopausal is I really don't give a fuck. I've lived for 50 years. According to science, I've got another 30, but, my knees hurt, so I don't think I could last that long. So really, what can happen to me? I mean, I really do. What's the worst? The worst thing that could happen to me is if my children, something happens to them.
Right.
Other than that, nothing else can happen to me. And I realised that actually, if you're in a position of power and influence, or if you have a mindset that hurt vulnerable people, I advocate for people. And it does relate to my story. So growing up with two parents of neurodiverseness, I grew up as a carer for two disabled adults. That's what I realised. I realised I was a carer. I realised that sometimes my mum couldn't get out of bed in the morning, so I had to do breakfast. I used to, as a child, with those old granny bags. I don't know if you have them in America. They've got 4 wheels.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like schlepping across like the intersection. Yeah.
So I was like age 10 and going to supermarkets, doing the family shopping because my mum couldn't get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
And so for me, I've been a carer of someone who had struggles. My dad had struggles, and also there's stuff around my gender, my ethnicity. I'm working class, so I don't know how many people are working class, but I'm working class and proud. I feel that classism is often demonised in all white, black and brown. And I feel in the UK, it's just not talked about.
Which is fascinating because sometimes it's more, I think, it's got its hooks in even deeper. It's true because it transcends all of those things. Yeah.
So I really don't care if I upset privilege.
I love it. I love it. And I there is something to be said as a woman who's so you said that you are at 50.
Yeah.
And I'm at 4. Actually, I turned 40 in like a few weeks. And so I'm approaching, and I have kind of the listeners to the podcast know this already, but 1 year ago, almost exactly, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The treatment was a total hysterectomy. I still do have my ovaries. So there was a whole complicated experience where I had this emotional, like post-surgery, obviously you're healing from all of this. It's very intense surgery. It's like 8 weeks to 12 weeks of healing. And then I was having these kind of emotional up and downs, and I realized like I'm having a period. I just don't bleed anymore because I don't have a uterus. And so I don't have this external cue of my sort of hormonal cycles like I used to. And this conversation about menopause, this conversation about these changes that occur, I'm going to know, but I'm not going to know. You know what I mean? I'm going to have certain symptoms as it comes closer, but I'm not going to have that indicator that my period is going away. And I think about these sort of very complex experiences of cis women and trans men and trans women and non-binary individuals, and how different their sort of relationship to their reproductive organs. I mean, I don't even know. Like it's so much more than that, right? But their relationship to their biology and their relationship to their sort of cultural identity, how much all of these things, and I don't know if this is the case for everybody, but as I get older, I give so fewer fucks about, right? And like, do you think it's is it an age thing? Is it a lived experience thing? That like
a combination.
More stuff, this matters now in a way that before I was afraid of the outcome. And now it's like, I'll fall on it. I don't care because I think this fucking we have to go there. We have to talk about it. You think if you lived 50 years ago, it would be the same, the older you got or do you think it's also matched to sort of the world we live in now?
I think it's a combination of everything. I think as a society, and I think it's correct that we are more, I suppose, woke, as they say. I think the fact that it's taken us this long to become woke. Yeah. Imagine how many people had to hide who they were for thousands of years.
Yeah.
But it's taken us this time to say, no, it's wrong to hate people based on who they love. It's wrong to hate people because of this and because of that. And people who from different areas have value. It's taken so long. So I'm disgusted by the fact it's taken us so long for us to value everyone.
Right. And, we're both working in our ways within a very deeply capitalistic system, right? You're trying to help people secure jobs, right? To secure employment, to secure housing, to secure mental health services. I think about this pure ethic that honestly, I'm 40 years old. And I think only within the last 10 years did it become, I was born and raised in Texas. Now I live in a much more liberal part of the country, but I am American. I was born into a very American ethic. And that has been the sort of rhetoric that has, been in my mind since the time I was born. But this idea of like, I deserve to just live. Just by virtue of the fact that I'm a human being, as do you. And like, I shouldn't have to earn my place in the world capitalistically. It's very hard to come back once you've opened your eyes. So that, like, once that genie has left the bottle. And I actually find that it's disruptive for me within my work. And so I'm super curious for you as somebody who's navigating social systems and who's working within a capitalistic structure that has a large social component, a larger social component than the one that my U.S. contingency is used to here. How do you navigate that validation of you are worthy, but also you need to get a job? You know what I mean? And also, like, this is how we measure worth in our culture and our society.
It's hard. I mean, one of the things that I always encourage people to do and to be is to kind of have a realization of their creative side. I find for some people, for some people, they don't want to work or they struggle to hold down a job for whatever reason, but they might have a passion. So I know one particular person, I got them to work at a supermarket, but I also got them to apply for jobs around playing the guitar in pubs.
That's cool.
And actually, the fulfillment of playing the guitar and getting out and socialising once a week made the other job manageable.
Right.
So overall, that person actually was in a better place economically and mentally, and they felt a certain degree of social fulfillment because they were allowed to express themselves creatively. And I think that comes from the fact that I'm a dyslexic. My weakness is writing words, but I don't have a problem talking. And I also understand for some people, it could be music, it could be drawing, it could be fashion, it could be gardening, it could be knitting. I know one particular woman, I told her to knit animals and sell them on Etsy. And she did. And she still does a job she hates, but she loves knitting animals.
Right. I love that. And, I think that there's this, I'm curious culturally, right? Because I don't live in this country. And I think that there is a very American and very pernicious rhetoric around, especially with individuals who utilize social services, around the word lazy, which makes me bananas. Like, as a mental health practitioner, when somebody says, oh, they're just lazy, or that's just, I'm like, no, there is, everything we do has a motivation behind it. Everything we do has an explanation. And, very often we're talking about undiagnosed depression, or we're talking about social pressures or whatever. But I'm curious, here in the UK, is that mudslinging that you see a lot? Is that, like, especially in your sector, are you seeing a lot of people, oh, they're lazy, and your job is to help them figure out how not to be lazy? I find that, like, the most racist, the most sexist. Like, I really struggle with that language. And so I'm curious how you take that language.
It's challenging. It's challenging. And sometimes I call it out, sometimes, and I'll give you an example of a time I didn't feel comfortable to call it out. So I was invited to a local lower school where I live, in the town I live in, because they had money and they wanted to pay deliverers to deliver activity to young people. And I worked for an organisation that did loads of sports activities around boxing and martial arts. So I was invited to talk in to tell people what we offered. And then the makeup of the lower school was about 80% ethnic minority, and it had a really high refugee element to the school. So all the teachers were white, and one of the head teachers said to me, well, the young people here, they haven't got enthusiasm, and to be a bit blunt, they're very lazy. So and at the time, because I was in a work position, I really wanted to address that with her, but I was actually sent there to get a job.
It was so diplomatic the way you said. I really wanted to address it with her.
To be honest with you, I did address it indirectly.
Yeah.
Because one of the trustees of the school is a Muslim counsellor. He's also my best friend.
So you could have that conversation.
So I had a conversation with the trustee, who then had a conversation with the head of that person.
Yeah.
I know, I'm in trouble.
But that mentality, that rhetoric, I find lazy. I find it so damaging that, it reminds me of, and I know I've referenced this on the show, and I don't want to take too much time because I do want to leave, I never get to have an open forum for questions on Talk Nerdy just by virtue of how it's designed. So I think it's going to be cool to be able to answer some questions in here. But, and I know I've referenced this on the show before, but there's this fascinating construct. There was a paper that was published many years ago about a belief in pure evil, where the researchers sort of developed a measure to see how much individuals believed in a concept called evil. And then they compared their ideologies and their mentalities about different social services and about punitive versus kind of not reconstructive, what's the word I'm looking for? What? Reparative. Yeah, that's not even whatever. In prison systems, right? Like rehabilitative. Yes. Programs. And they found, of course, that people who believe in pure evil are less likely to want to see people rehabilitated because they don't think that people can change. They think that they're somehow infected or I don't know, with bad. And this very black and white thinking that we were talking about. This person is lazy. Not this person is. Their life was shaped by all of these different pressures, and this is where they are now. And we all have this kind of ability to grow and change, and really, I think, to find self-efficacy within ourselves and to address our own mental health burdens and things of that nature. But it's. I don't know why I see this parallel between this very deep black and white thinking and what I think of as a very American ethic that's quite problematic, that there's an assumption that everybody comes from an equal playing ground, and that if you're not doing what is expected or you haven't gotten where you're expected to be, it's simply because you're not working hard enough. It's ludicrous to me, but it's so pervasive in my country. Do you find that rhetoric or that ethic?
I definitely think that exists.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I'm slightly biased because I work in spaces where I work with people who have so many layers of barriers. That's my Monday to Friday. And I do acknowledge the fact that because I work in this space, that's made me biased. And I do understand that. But at the same time, I work with people who constantly are devalued, who are presumed to be stupid, who are constantly traumatized. I mean, the example I gave about the school, which were predominantly ethnic minority, that teacher probably talks down to her students. So those children who already are traumatized, and that's where the interpretation of lazy comes in. They're traumatized young people, are then being nurtured by a tutor, a teacher, who is then using their bias to devalue them.
Right.
So by the time they hit 18, they probably already feel so small.
Yeah.
They're so unmotivated and so unengaged with the country that they've come to empower them.
Right. And I think, and part of the reason that it's so pernicious is that very often we are lacking the actual insight into why we feel that way. And so it's it's so under the radar and it's almost unconscious that then it's no, I'm just internalized that I'm bad. I am just bad. And I can't point to all of the things that reinforced this rhetoric in me. And I can't see them for what they are. I just am that way. And to undo that sort of social programming is really difficult. As we know, I mean, we're just much more plastic when we're young. We're much more sponge-like. And so it takes almost like equal and opposite effort as an adult, which is very, very, very difficult to do. So, there's so much more. I always say this at the end, I could talk to you for 10 hours, and I could. But I do want to protect, I think we've got... we've got like almost 10 minutes. So the way that we'll do it, because it is a podcast, is that if anybody does have a question, just raise your hand. I'll point to you. Keep it kind of short because I'm going to repeat it into the microphone, and then we'll have that conversation. And, okay, go ahead.
I really thank you for presenting, especially at the other panel. I learned quite a bit. Would you share one more story that gets you up in the morning that energizes you?
Okay, so he was asking for stories that get you up in the morning that energize you. Was this? I missed the panel. Was that a conversation that was had on the panel?
It was on menopause.
But like you talked about kind of what gets you going. Wait, you're like stealing my final two questions, but okay. It's okay, we can skip them this week. What gets you going in the morning?
This is going to sound really boring, but I just really love my children. so I get emotional. So my neurodiverse children have had a really hard time. Mm-hmm. And even when my son was younger, he was neurodiverse, he was constantly being bullied. And also it was really sad because he was in a school where it was multicultural and he was experiencing racist abuse. And he came home one day and said, "Mum, I don't want to live."
Oh. And what do you do? Yeah.
But now he's such a happy person. My son's taught himself how to edit videos. He works for some of the biggest YouTube youth editors in the country. He even got an email from their senior Sky editor for this country, which is a really big channel, asking whether he could do some editing for him last week, and he's only just turned 18.
What do you think shifted?
And this is always the thing I tell people, if you're different, it's okay.
Yeah.
And I think that my son was in a space where he was naturally, because he's neurodiverseness, I'm his mum, he's going to be a bit quirky. So, and there's the element of and I suppose this is where my neurodiverseness, I'm proud to be defiant. I don't accept what you give me because you tell me it's right. I assess it. If I feel it's right and it fits in with my ethics and my values and it doesn't hurt good people, then I'll go with it. If it's going to hurt or deprave someone, I will not. And I taught my son and my daughter to question things so they don't automatically, as young people, fit in slots, and they don't try and fit in, but they accept people's difference. So they're not seeking a gang to hang out in, but they like all gangs. Sounds a bit weird, isn't it? They like all gangs. So but because of that, when you're young, it doesn't always work. And I think that my son at one point, he really struggled. He didn't want to go to school. That was part of my job in the morning, was to try and make him happy. He's happy now. And I've got two happy children. My daughter came back a few weeks ago because she's doing a degree in filmmaking, and she spent 2 weeks in South Africa doing filming a documentary. Now, I'm a working class single black mother who lives in an economically deprived area, and my kids, 18, 20, I think they're doing amazing.
Yeah.
So for me, what gets me up in the morning, what makes me happy, is knowing that I'm part of their success. And so, yeah.
I love that. And so I just want to ensure before I ask somebody else, can I go straight to 12? Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. So we do have 5 more minutes. All right. So again, keep it nice and short, and then I'll repeat it into the mic.
Is there any organisations that you can suggest that we can get involved in breaking down systemic abuses of minorities?
Any organizations that you can suggest that can help people get involved in breaking down systemic abuses of minorities?
I think it depends on where you live. I mean, maybe afterwards we can have a conversation, because the problem is sometimes when organisations are so large and you need money to run all organisations, is that sometimes the advocacy and activism is lost, and people just spend all their time creating infrastructures. So I think maybe I would need to know where you live, and then I would do maybe some research based on the area.
Do you know any organizations, and obviously this is like going to be kind of UK centric, and I'm going to mention somebody who I've had on the show recently, who I think is doing an incredible work, but do you know any organizations who sort of watchdog NGOs or who watchdog local charities to help ensure that you are putting your money into an appropriate place? So I think it is important, right? Like all charities are not created equal.
I personally don't know. I mean, my concern is probably we need more of them.
Right.
Because I do my third sector work and my activism work, but I'm self-governed.
Right.
I would not ethically involve my time in exploitation of anyone.
Right.
And that's why I call it out when I see it. But I also know there are people in the third sector who exploit the third sector.
Of course.
Yeah. So for me, I just self-govern who I work with. I don't go to an agency.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention, I had a physician, actually, medical doctor and clinical researcher, infectious diseases on the show. I'm trying to find what country she's currently working in. I think in Uganda, who also is involved in an organization. Her name's Miriam Lekay. Lekay. She's involved in an organization called Give Directly. And I know this is like a slightly different conversation than you were having, but I do really love that approach to community-based advocacy and activism and just like infrastructure growth and things of that nature is like giving directly to the people. So there's sort of like these infusions of cash for individuals to do the work on the grounds in their local region because they know best what they need. And I think it's a really great organizational structure instead of saying like, I know best for you what you need because I am way over. Yeah. So I do highly recommend looking into Give Directly if that's something you're interested in. I think we have 2 minutes, so one more very quick. What's up?
Okay. First of all, congratulations on everything you're doing and how you're doing with your children who are now grown up. I think that's fantastic. Has your neurodiversity and neurodivergence, do you think, helped in how you processed all of this stuff? I'm an autistic physicist myself, so I kind of feel my emotional response, which is different to how other people respond, has helped me in many ways.
Right. So has your neurodivergence helped you in the work that you do?
It's my superpower.
Love it. All right. Well, our time has come to an end here on the show at QED. I just want to thank Anita Powell so much for spending time, for opening up, for being so raw and authentic and sharing so much of your wisdom with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to everybody listening, I am looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.